In the autumn of 2014, when Elizabeth Sullivan was reported missing, the San Diego police suspected foul play. Over the following weeks, suspicions grew, but the evidence regarding what happened to the young mother remained scarce. Friends insisted that something terrible must have occurred, but her family wasn't entirely convinced. Elizabeth Sullivan was a complicated and resourceful woman, and it was possible that her disappearance was by design, that she didn't want to be found. Today's case explores the story of a missing person with a tumultuous past. It took years to uncover the full story, and when it was finally revealed, the truth was just as complicated. Elizabeth Sullivan, a 31-year-old mother of two, was known for her vibrant personality and intellect. According to those closest to her, she was more than just charismatic, fashionable, and humorous. Her intelligence set her apart. Friends and acquaintances were drawn to Elizabeth for her wit, creativity, and the depth of her knowledge. In 2014, Elizabeth lived in the Liberty Station neighborhood of San Diego, California, with her husband, Matthew, and their two young daughters aged 2 and 4. The area, once a naval training center, featured spacious homes, and the Sullivans rented a multi-level house. Elizabeth had moved to California just a few years earlier, after meeting Matthew, who was in the U.S. Navy. The couple had married and started their family shortly after Elizabeth relocated from her home state of Virginia. Life in California was still new to Elizabeth. After Matthew's work with the Navy required him to be deployed for extended periods, Elizabeth adjusted to life as a single mother. She made friends and maintained an active social life. However, everything changed on October 14th, when the San Diego Police Department announced that Elizabeth was missing. Elizabeth's close friend, Nathan Character, had alerted the police when he couldn't reach her. He had a bad feeling and suspected something might have happened to her. Elizabeth had last been seen the previous day by her husband, Matthew, who had just returned to San Diego between deployments. Investigators found Elizabeth's car still in the garage, and the house was somewhat messy, but there was nothing that clearly pointed to foul play. Matthew noted that a family suitcase appeared to be missing. Investigators also discovered that the day before her disappearance, Elizabeth had transferred more than $1,000 from the joint bank account to her personal one. This raised the possibility that Elizabeth may have decided to leave voluntarily. Investigators dug deeper into Elizabeth's life, going through her journals. They uncovered stories written by Elizabeth, reflecting her creative imagination. One particular story mirrored her own life, featuring a female protagonist who, disillusioned with her new life, abandoned it and started fresh. This parallel raised suspicions that Elizabeth may have been planning to leave her family behind. The last message Elizabeth sent from her phone was on October 13th. It would be the final contact she had with anyone. Days later, her phone was turned off. Matthew, though concerned, wasn't shocked by her absence. He explained that Elizabeth had a tendency to become emotionally unstable at times. They had argued just days before, as Matthew had invited his mother, Michelle Sullivan, and her partner to come live with them. Elizabeth was not happy with this arrangement, as she didn't get along with her mother-in-law. The argument escalated, and Elizabeth left the house without returning. Matthew suspected that she might have left for good, but he had no concrete evidence to suggest anything sinister. As investigators delved deeper into Elizabeth's life, they discovered that Elizabeth and Matthew had been living separate lives for years. Due to Matthew's long deployments, Elizabeth had taken on the role of a single mother, and their marriage had deteriorated. Friends reported that there had been accusations of domestic abuse, and the police had been called to the house on more than one occasion. To cope with the stresses, Elizabeth began to over-medicate and even had an affair with a man she met on Tinder. She seemed to be living two separate lives. One as a devoted wife and mother, the other as someone with dangerous habits and a secret relationship. On October 19th, the San Diego Police Department confirmed a sighting of Elizabeth at the Liberty Station soccer fields, just 2 days after she was reported missing. Two off-duty deputies who were at the park with their child spoke to Elizabeth. She appeared disheveled and possibly under the influence of something. She explained that she had not been home the night before and had lost her phone. The deputies helped her search, but they didn't find it. A full week later, another sighting of Elizabeth was confirmed near the San Diego International Airport. Despite these sightings, Elizabeth's whereabouts remained unclear, and the mystery surrounding her disappearance continued to grow.
I feel like she's in trouble, and I've come out here from Virginia to look for her, to let her know we're here. It can happen to you, and when it does, it gets very personal. And it takes on a whole new light when it happens to you. And you get a strength like you never had before, because that's my daughter. I'm bringing her home. We aren't going to let this go.
By November of 2014, a month after Elizabeth Sullivan was reported missing, there had been no new sightings of her. That month, Matthew decided to grant an interview to People magazine, where he shared his grief and frustration. "I'm running on fumes right now. I don't know where to look. I'm always searching around the neighborhood, hoping to catch a glimpse of her," he confessed. "I think about her constantly. I can't stop. The girls are my biggest concern right now. I have to keep going, do what I need to do for them, and keep praying." Meanwhile, the missing persons team had investigated the sighting near the airport, but found the report to be false. However, they still believed the credible accounts from those who had seen Elizabeth in the park. They continued to circulate her image and description, hoping for any further leads. Investigators also began monitoring Matthew's behavior. While he publicly appeared devastated, friends of Elizabeth noted that within a month of her disappearance, Matthew had returned to the dating scene. He even moved his new girlfriend into the family home in Liberty Station. By the 10th month after Elizabeth vanished, the case had gone cold, and there were still no leads. On October 4th, 2016, nearly 2 years after her disappearance, a woman's body was discovered floating in a channel near Liberty Station. The San Diego County Medical Examiner identified the body as Elizabeth Sullivan. The cause of death was determined to be sharp force trauma, meaning Elizabeth had been stabbed. The case was then transferred to the homicide unit of the San Diego Police Department for further investigation. On the day Elizabeth's body was discovered, Matthew was in the process of moving out of the Liberty Station house. He and his new girlfriend, who was pregnant with their child, were seeking more space. Despite the shocking discovery, Matthew continued with his plans without interruption. 3 days after Elizabeth was recovered from the water, he moved out of state, seemingly unaffected by the tragic news. As homicide detectives revisited the early investigation, certain details from the initial case began to hold more significance. They discovered that Elizabeth had transferred over $1,000 into her personal bank account before disappearing, and the balance had remained untouched. However, there was one peculiar transaction: a payment to a divorce attorney. It became clear that Elizabeth had been contemplating leaving her marriage. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Elizabeth had confided in Matthew about an affair she had been having. This revelation led to arguments, particularly about custody of their children. Matthew seemed convinced that Elizabeth intended to accuse him falsely to have him arrested and gain full custody of their daughters. The day Elizabeth vanished, Matthew had called 911 to report his concerns, suggesting that something was wrong. Yet, in hindsight, it became evident that the issues between Elizabeth and Matthew had been escalating for some time, with the strain of their relationship and the growing tensions contributing to a tragic end.
San Diego Police, this is Melanie.
Hi. I have concerns. My wife is trying to have me, evicted or arrested from my house and take my children away from me.
Okay.
I mean, she took my personal credit card, used it to hire a lawyer against me. I haven't been served with any papers yet, but I know she's called your department earlier this morning, and I think that's where she's headed now to try to get me detained.
And she said that she took all the money out of your shared bank account?
I just checked it. It's all gone. There's nothing. Maybe 15 cents left. I'm still here with my children, and I don't know what she's doing.
If she comes back and there's some problems, or you can call us back when she's there.
Okay.
After Matthew had moved out of state, the San Diego Police Department conducted another search of the Liberty Station home. This time, they were focused on finding something specific. In the attic space above what had been Matthew's bedroom, police carefully removed insulation from the beams and scoured every corner and crevice. Their persistence paid off when they uncovered a military-style folding knife. tests revealed blood on the blade, and DNA analysis confirmed that it was Elizabeth Sullivan's blood. What was even more crucial was the discovery that Matthew's DNA was found on the handle. The knife became the key piece of evidence they needed to move forward with their case. On January 31, 2018, Matthew Sullivan was arrested outside his new home in Wyoming, Delaware. He was later extradited to California as authorities prepared their case. However, there was one glaring issue that the prosecution needed to resolve. Two medical examiners had concluded that Elizabeth's body showed signs of decomposition that suggested she had not been dead for 2 years, as initially thought. Instead, they determined she had likely died just 2 months before her body was discovered. This raised a critical question for the prosecution. If Elizabeth had been killed on October 13, 2014, the day she was last heard from, how had her body remained undiscovered for so long? The investigation team worked to reconcile this inconsistency. During the second search of the house, cadaver dogs were alerted to a large freestanding freezer. Though it was empty, the police believed that it had once held a body. Investigators remembered that the same freezer had been plugged into a power socket in the garage next to Elizabeth's car during the first search. When they opened the freezer back then, it had been empty, but now they suspected it had once been used to store Elizabeth's body. The state's theory was that Matthew had kept Elizabeth's body hidden for nearly 2 years. As his move to Delaware approached, he had disposed of her remains, hoping that they would remain hidden in the water. This theory fit with the timeline, and authorities now had the pieces to build a compelling case against Matthew Sullivan.
It's our belief that the evidence will show the defendant killed Elizabeth by stabbing her with a knife. He then hid the body.
It's an incredible loss. They have 2 beautiful children. They have a long, storied history. And Mr. Sullivan, as I stated in court, is a Navy veteran who's traveled the world defending freedom. And it is now going to be his chance to be served by the institutions that he defended.
Matthew Sullivan's murder trial officially began on February 21, 2020. During the proceedings, Matthew's defense attorney presented a case aimed at casting doubt on the prosecution's narrative. The defense argued that Elizabeth had been unpredictable and prone to leaving without warning. They claimed that Elizabeth struggled with drug abuse, which could have contributed to her behavior. Additionally, they contended that the theory about the freezer was purely speculative. They pointed out that there was no concrete evidence suggesting that Elizabeth had ever been hidden in the freezer. Matthew's legal team emphasized that law enforcement had conducted multiple searches of the house and failed to find any trace of Elizabeth during those investigations. Moreover, Matthew had lived in the house with his children and later with his mother, her partner, and his new girlfriend. Yet no one had discovered any evidence pointing to Elizabeth being hidden there. The defense sought to undermine the prosecution's timeline and theories, suggesting that the case was built on conjecture rather than solid proof.
The evidence will show that Elizabeth's family and her friends will report a history of finding a man, finding independence, deciding abruptly to turn the page on her life, and not necessarily sharing with everybody who would otherwise be included normally in such a decision. Her father will tell you about this pattern. Her friends will tell you about this pattern. Her friends from Virginia and her friends from San Diego. You're not going to hear one bit of evidence of Matthew Sullivan trying to secret away parts of his home. And at the end of the day, when the evidence is all put through, after several witnesses, it will not be able to divert your attention from the fact that the evidence is consistent with the life that Elizabeth Sullivan had led to that point, and that while her passing, while tragic, cannot be attributed to Matthew Sullivan.
By the time the trial commenced, the off-duty officers who had previously reported speaking with Elizabeth at the park had reconsidered the timing of the encounter. They now believed they had confused the dates. The meeting had actually taken place a few days before Elizabeth was reported missing, not after. This was confirmed when investigators found that Elizabeth had spent the night of October 11th at a homeless shelter, not returning home. This information supported the deputies' account of their interaction with Elizabeth in the park on the 12th, and it became clear that Elizabeth had indeed been alive after October 14th, contrary to the initial assumption. Although these early sightings were initially dismissed, the evidence pointed to the possibility that Elizabeth had been alive and well after the 14th. Elizabeth's boyfriend, Steve Sutton, had initially been uncooperative with law enforcement. He hired an attorney and refused to take a polygraph test. However, after being ruled out as a potential suspect, Steve later told investigators that weeks into the search, he had received emails from someone claiming to be Elizabeth. The messages, sent from an unrecognized email address, were signed off with Elizabeth's name. As a test, Steve asked the person to identify a detail only Elizabeth would know: the keychain to the hot tub where they had spent time together. To Steve's surprise, the writer answered correctly. Matthew's defense team seized on this fact, arguing that the only person who could have known that detail was Elizabeth herself. However, Steve could not produce the emails, as he had deleted them. He explained this away, but it raised questions about the authenticity of the messages and whether they were really from Elizabeth.
Once you were no longer dating Elizabeth Sullivan, did you maintain any communication with her?
Yeah, there would be every now and then text or email. She would reach out when she's like feeling lonely or something like that, and I would respond. I would answer her.
And what was her demeanor, her tone like when you spoke to her?
She seemed happy.
And did you and she talk about what she was doing and what her plan was with respect to Matthew and her marriage?
She told me she was getting divorced. She said she was filing a restraint order.
The prosecution believed that Elizabeth's affair with Steve and her plans to divorce Matthew were the motive for her murder. Her closest friends testified that Elizabeth had expressed unhappiness in her marriage and had planned to leave Matthew, supporting the state's theory of a motive based on emotional and relational conflict.
Things were just not good at home. Matt apparently was making her feel really guilty about it, and she was just a wreck.
Elizabeth's closest friend from Virginia, Calandra Harris, had been in regular contact with her, speaking on the phone every day.
We would have to end our conversations because Matt was either coming, listening, she was afraid he was coming.
Did she seem to be afraid of him?
Yes. She was going to pack her things. She met with an attorney, so far as I know. She met with an attorney, and she was trying to figure out what her rights were, what she could and couldn't do, and yes, she was going to go to a hotel.
Kendra and Elizabeth had a phone conversation on the night of October 13th. Elizabeth was at home, and so was her husband, Matthew. By that time, Matthew was aware of the affair and the impending divorce, and he was visibly angry.
I told her to lock herself in her room or her girl's room, have a glass of wine, and we just needed to make it to morning.
What was her response to that?
She said, I had my vino, and I'm going to lock myself in my room. I then said, if you feel that seriously about it, if it doesn't get any better, call the police in San Diego.
And did she respond to that?
She said, hold on a sec. And then she said, gotta go, quietly. I didn't hear from her anymore.
And that was your last conversation with Elizabeth?
Yes.
Inside Elizabeth's bedroom, where it was believed she had been hiding while speaking with Kendra, forensic teams used luminol to detect blood. The test revealed blood traces on the floor leading to the bathroom. Inside the bedroom, additional areas were found, and blood spatter stains were discovered on the bathroom door. When the carpet was pulled up, a larger stain was uncovered, and testing confirmed it belonged to Elizabeth. The carpet had been meticulously cleaned. The jury was informed that on October 14th, Matthew Sullivan had gone to a Home Depot store and purchased carpet cleaner.
Took his rubber knife, and he stabbed her. And then he stabbed her again, and again, and again, and again. He hit her body. He hit the murder weapon. cleaned up the crime scene and hid it. This is the bank record that shows you his debit card purchase at Ace Hardware to buy that carpet cleaner.
This wasn't the first time she'd left without saying where she was going. It wasn't the first time she'd been gone overnight. Something only somebody who had been in that experience, on that affair, in that adventure could know. The emailer responded with the correct answer. Something only Stephen Sutton and Elizabeth Sullivan could have known. She was found about 200 yards from the park that we know that she slept in on nights when she would not be at home. Married to a Navy man who had a secret life, who had a history of behavior that was erratic, and who had a history of leaving.
When the jury began their deliberations, they faced the task of determining not only whether Matthew Sullivan had killed his wife, but also whether to convict him of first-degree or second-degree murder. After careful consideration, the jury reached a verdict. We, the jury, in the above-entitled case find the defendant, Matthew Scott Sullivan, not guilty of the crime of first-degree murder.
We, the jury, in the above-entitled cause find the defendant, Matthew Scott Sullivan, not guilty of the crime of first-degree murder. We, the jury, in the above-entitled cause find the defendant, Matthew Scott Sullivan, guilty of the crime of second-degree murder.
During Matthew's sentencing hearing, his defense attorney sought leniency, highlighting his 8 years of service in the U.S. Navy. Matthew had been honorably discharged and received several commendations, including the Global Terrorism Service Medal, the Humanities Service Medal, and the Navy Good Conduct Medal. However, for those who loved Elizabeth, no sentence could ever compensate for the pain of their loss.
This sentence won't make the pain go away, nor will my recanting of the sorrow I've gone through these last 6.5 years make this man feel any differently than he does now.
Matt has caused a tremendous amount of pain to me, Liz's family, and friends. There are no words to describe this pain that still sits in the pit of my heart. I pray that Matt never see or experience freedom again.
Matthew Sullivan was sentenced to 16 years to life in prison for second-degree murder. According to the latest update in his California incarceration records, he will be eligible for parole in August 2028.